We now turn to our senior national and environmental correspondent, Ben Tracy. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So, Ben, we hear Florida's Governor DeSantis say things like this is a 500-year flood event. They've never experienced anything like this. What's making the storm hit differently?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the context of climate change. And we should say, first off, that climate change doesn't cause a hurricane to happen. But scientists increasingly believe that climate change is making hurricanes stronger and more destructive. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's that the ocean waters are much warmer than they used to be, and warm ocean water is rocket fuel for a hurricane. So when one of these storms passes over this warm water, it just turbocharges this thing, and it's what they call rapid intensification. And we're seeing this more often. They actually believe since 2017, we've had about 30 storms that have rapidly intensified right before they hit the coast. And that's a huge issue for people in these coastal communities because they don't have as much time to prepare for that. So we actually rode along on the hurricane hunting aircraft with NOAA scientists who are looking into this phenomenon. They're actually deploying a drone for the first time down into a hurricane. They did this on Wednesday. They dropped it down into Hurricane Ian, and they're trying to detect where this rapid intensification happens and why it happens so they can provide more warnings for people in these communities. So there's definitely a climate connection here. And in addition to all of that, climate change is making the atmosphere warmer, and that means there's more water. So there's more rain when these storms hit, and that leads to flooding.
So taxpayers just invested this historic amount of money in trying to control climate change. That's what President Biden sold it as, and Democrats supported. You also have FEMA sending a record $3.5 billion to states to help lessen disaster impact. Is this record investment going where the scientists say it needs to go?
Well, the scientists would say that any money that is spent to more quickly wean us off of fossil fuels, to transition us to renewable forms of energy, is where the money is best spent. Of course, if you're the government, you also know that you have to deal with disasters when they happen and the impacts those are having on people and property. So they're trying to do both things here. But you talk about the historic investment. I mean, this is about $370 billion for climate initiatives. But a very small amount of that, only about $4 billion to $5 billion, is going for what they call climate resilience. So this would go to help some of these coastal communities rebuild wetlands, build seawalls, the kinds of things that you need for protection. But scientists will say, as long as we keep burning fossil fuels, we're just digging a hole and we're making that hole bigger. So that's where the money needs to be spent. That's why you hear a lot about some of the renewable energy provisions of this, the electric car credits, the things that we can do in our own homes to stop using fossil fuels.
And that's an important part of this story. But again, immediate versus long term.
Exactly. And you're going to see projects all over this country where they're building massive infrastructure projects to try to defend the coast. But the one thing most people never want to talk about is a phenomenon called managed retreat. And this is not something Americans like to hear, but it's this issue of, should we be rebuilding in these areas that are prone to get hit over and over again? And at what point does that just become financially irresponsible if you can't get insurance in these areas? So you then have people who lose their homes, their businesses, and they're just left flat broke.
And that's a question for any governor in one of these coastal communities. You also had this decision at the Supreme Court in the last term that it was West Virginia versus the EPA, and it threw into question the ability of federal agencies to make regulation without Congress basically telling them it's their job to do so. So that seems to indicate it's going to be up to Congress to come up with some of these directives. And yet we have such partisan divide on even using the phrase climate change.
Exactly. This was a big wake-up call for the Biden administration that was really hoping to do a lot of this through executive action. And they're realizing that a lot of that might not stand up in court if they take that path. Basically, what the court is saying is, Congress, if you want to do these things, you got to pass laws. Like, you have to get in the game here. And as you say, this has been a polarizing issue. So you're going to need Republicans who are willing to go along with Democrats on some of these climate initiatives. And there is polling that shows that this is a pretty low priority for a lot of Republicans and Republican voters. So somehow we're going to have to overcome that divide if you're going to get Congress to work together on this. And as we know, Congress can flip from one part to the other pretty quickly. And this is a long-term issue that's going to need sustained focus and funding if we're going to make progress.
Ben, great context. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll be right back with a lot more Face the Nation. Stay with us.